And we would like to introduce you to our viewers as the world's greatest pilgrim photographer.
You could say both of those. You know, there's a fellow, Bin Battuta, who used to, hundreds and hundreds of years ago was considered the greatest of the Islamic pilgrims. And I think in one sense, his pilgrimage is well, it's certainly very interesting, but he wasn't able to fly on planes. But certainly I've been to more places than he has. I've probably been to more pilgrimage places than anybody ever. Yeah. And a very interesting thing about me is most people that study pilgrimage, they study it from the vantage point of social anthropology or archaeology or tourism, but they don't study it. They don't go to these places from the vantage point of a pilgrim. Now, that's a very distinct difference between me and other people. I started as a pilgrim, and then because I'm a great book reader, I read lots and lots of books. And then I went to, I'd say it's really about 2,500 of these sites in 168 countries. And so along the way, I read a great deal. And I read all of the works. In my library, you don't see it here, it's in a room back there. I have about 3,500 books, which are all just on this subject. And I've read virtually everything these social anthropologists have written in English or that has been translated in English. And a critique, not a criticism, but a critique I have of these fellows is very often they measure things and they interview a few pilgrims, but mostly it seems to me they're missing what pilgrimage is really about. And I can go into more detail about that if you wish.
Yeah, this is something, we have the Chennai season in India, and the morning sessions of the Chennai season are the musicologists who discuss music. And in the evening, we listen to the music, which takes us to another world. One is experiencing the music itself, and one is talking and reading about music. So would you say that it's similar?
I would say it's very, very similar. I think a parallel journey is very important. And in the sense of musicology, the musicologists have something to tell us. Very important. They can talk about the history of the music. They can talk about the notes. They can talk about music. And then there's the listening of the music. And you could hear musicologists talk for hundreds of years, but you wouldn't have an experience of the music. And to me, again, a parallel journey is very important. But if I would have to choose, if somebody said, okay, Martin, you can only have one or the other, what would you choose? And I'd say by far, I would choose the experience of the music rather than have a scientist or even a musicologist tell me something about it. In the same way, rather than having a social anthropologist tell me about what, the social anthropologists, they have this term called a catchment field, meaning where do the pilgrimage sites get their people from? And so maybe they're international, or maybe they're a hemispheric, or maybe they're a national. That's where the people come from. But if we talk to the people, the pilgrims themselves, they're going to say something entirely different. They're not going to talk about where they came from. They're going to talk about their experience of being a pilgrim. And to me, that's much more important.
So you talk about in one of your interviews, Martin, about people going to these sacred sites for two reasons: to say thank you and please. But in the Indian tradition, we say that it's for union with the divine. I mean, even in the salutations in our mantras, they say the most effective ones are where you chant the name or you praise the Lord. And somewhere down the order is the please and the thanks. So how does that work in different traditions?
Well, if you look, for a long time, maybe 20 years, because I've been doing this for 42 years now, for 20 years, I saw differences. I saw Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, Jews. I saw all these different people, coming from different religions, coming from different countries, and it looked it appeared like they were doing different things. And then one time when I was in Mecca, in Saudi Arabia, I saw people, see, now this is very interesting, because if you go to Muslim mosques, people will say surahs, and each day they will say a certain surah that is for that day. So in a sense, there's a regulation. There is not a freedom for people to express their own yearnings, their own devotions, because they're captivated by the religious dictates. But I was watching these people, and the women were not covered. It's really interesting. In Mecca, the center of Wahhabism, the women were not covered, and people were doing something that you did not see in Muslim mosques. And they were praying with a passion. They weren't chanting surahs. They were praying. And I looked at that and I thought, this is very interesting. When we free people of the dictates, of the control of a religious structure, then they're free to do what they would do if they didn't have an imposition of a religious structure on them. And so around that same time, I'd been to so many different pilgrimage sites, not just religious sites, but pilgrimage sites of all these different religions. And I began examining that. And then I started looking through that lens as I continued to go to pilgrimage sites. And I'm going to make a difference between pilgrimage sites and normal religious sites in a minute. But I saw in all the different pilgrimage sites of these different religions, people were doing the same thing. They weren't holding a religious text. What they were doing is they were praying very deeply. And I interviewed them. I talked to a whole lot of them, and I got a lot of answers. And I considered those answers, and I thought people are doing two things: prayer and praise, saying please and thank you. Now, it may look like, I just ate. It may look like they're chanting a sutra. It may look like they're reading, from the Puranas. It may look like all of those things. But what drew them, what attracted them to the pilgrimage place? And that was a hope for a connection with divinity. And whether they frame that notion of a divinity as Shiva or Saraswati or Shakti or whatever, it was a connection. They were seeking a connection with the divine. And in Hinduism, we have all these different deities, but they're all manifestation of one divinity. And so people who do not have, or even if they have a deep experience of that divinity, there's still a tendency to look at that divinity through one particular lens. Okay, I'm a Shiva devotee, I'm a Vishnu devotee, I'm a Shakti devotee, and they look through it through that lens. But if you talk to them, you'll say, we're speaking about the one divine. And so when people come to these sites, my feeling is that what they're doing is they're seeking a connection with that divinity that actually has no religion, has no gender, has no characteristic. The gender, of the divinity, the characteristics are something that human beings impose upon them or ascribe to them. Divinity has none of that. Divinity is free. Divinity is beyond all of that. Divinity gives rise to human beings, and human beings have particular philosophical and psychological notions that they impose on the divinity. But I feel that if divinity was looking down, divinity would go, oh, these silly human beings, they're putting things in boxes. But if the human beings got a big enough view, they'd see the confines of the boxes were no longer there. In the same way that if you look at a political map of the world, you'll see all of these lines that are drawn by politicians and historians, all these lines that are drawn. But if you go out into space and you're looking down at the planet, you just see one Earth. There's no lines separating Sudan from Ethiopia, from India from Pakistan. There are no lines. That is a human imposition. And I study history very much. And in my library in there, I have about 20, 30 historical atlases. Historical atlases. Most atlases just show political maps of how the world looks now. But historical atlases show political maps of how the world looked in the 17th century, the 15th century, the 10th century. And there's lots of different lines. Well, how do we explain this? Well, what it is there are different political systems and social systems that have the notion, oh, this is our empire, this is our country, and this is what we own, this is what we control. So if they were to draw a line, they would draw a line here, but it was still one earth. And in the same way, I feel a lot of social anthropologists, what they do is they make divisions. And I feel a lot of religious people, they say, well, I'm a Hindu, I'm not a Buddhist, even though they're very similar. And I'm not a Jew, or I'm not a Christian. And yet, ultimately, you know, in Islam, you know, Allah is God. And in all religions, if you look at them closely, very, very closely, and you read their scriptures very, very deeply, you will see they're talking about the same thing. And so I think when people come to those sites, what they're doing is they're approaching that divinity, however they conceive of that divinity, they're approaching it with love, with devotion. And if you are with, let's say you're in your room and divinity manifested for you. It would happen to Ramakrishna, 1838 to 1888. Divinity manifested for him. And when divinity manifested for Ramakrishna, guaranteed, and I've read, you know, the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna twice, guaranteed Ramakrishna was not saying scriptures to him. All Ramakrishna was doing was worshiping the divine. And so that is what I feel happens at the pilgrimage sites.
So we have the concept of Purusha in yogic sciences. We also have the Purusha in our architecture, this Shilpa Shastra also. So the consciousness that is there in the physical human body is also, you know, kind of planted into the temple. It's the Garbha Graha, which is the divine womb. And then we have the Prana Pratishta, where we infuse prana into the divinity. So we're not really very separate, you know, the divine and the individual in how it is conceptualized in Hinduism. So you started your journey in India. Do you feel a yogic journey also took place simultaneously, Martin, from the age of 12 to at such a very young age to know what's going to happen, and it unfolded in such beautiful visionary ways? So was there also a parallel yogic journey?
Yes, but I didn't know it at the time. And earlier I talked about when maybe 20 years into my pilgrimage, and 20 years into my pilgrimage, maybe I'd gone to 50 countries and I'd read 200 books. I wish I would have had a teacher. I mean, I'd had a guru in India before, but he didn't understand this subject. But I wish I would have had a teacher who both really understood the scholarly study of a lot of different pilgrimage traditions and had gone to sacred sites himself and had that experience. I wish I would have had that. So they could have explained things to me of what was going on inside of me. And what was going on inside of me was it was being revealed to me. Something was being revealed to me, and I was beginning to see connections between these different religious traditions and what both the historians and the scientists and the archaeologists were saying and what the pilgrims were saying. I began to see connections. I began to see commonalities. I began to see similarities. And I began to understand that I was on a yogic journey, and yoga means union. Yoga means union. I think that's very, very important to people to understand. They talk about jnana yoga and kundalini yoga and raja yoga and all these different yogas, but they're all methods of attaining, of seeking and attaining that union with divinity. That's very, very important. And they also say there's appropriate yogas for each yuga, and I understand that. And now we're in the so-called Kali Yuga, and the most appropriate yoga is Bhakti yoga, which is my particular path. But for me, I lived in India when I was 12 to 16, and my father was a military attaché, which is a way of saying a diplomat, and he couldn't travel because he was working. And my mother loved to travel, and she had the free time. And I remember the first journey she and I went on was to Benares, where Rana Singh lives, dear friend of mine. And Rana is very interesting because Rana knows this science, the study, the history, and the anthropology of Hindu pilgrimage. Rana's not an expert on Buddhist pilgrimage in India or Islam. I'm also that. But Rana knows Hindu pilgrimage in India better than anybody in the world. So but I didn't know Rana at that time, but I went to Benares with my mother and you go on tours. And when you go on a tour, they take you to places of historical interest in monumental architecture. And when they take you to a place of monumental architecture, you're at a temple. And so when you're in the temple, you're in a place where people have done ceremony for hundreds or thousands of years. You're in a place that was constructed with devotion. And a really, really interesting thing about Hindu temples is they're constructed with devotion, and there's the consecration rituals. Extremely important, because if you just have a temple, and the temple can be very beautiful, and you can have a very beautiful statue of a deity in there, and in a sense, it's not alive. It's only with the consecration ritual that the deity comes into the statue and comes into the temple. I didn't know anything about this at that point. Didn't know anything. I'm 12 years old, but I'm at the place. And visually, I liked it. Visually, I liked it. And there was something else, but I didn't have the vocabulary to say what that is, but I felt good. I liked it. Then we went to Kathmandu, Nepal on a different journey. And there is a Buddhist temple there that was originally a Hindu temple. It's called Swayambhu Nath, Nath meaning place, Swayambhu. You know what Swayambhu means. And so my mother and I had gone there during the day. And in that night, my mother went to bed and I got up at the hotel and I walked back to Swayambhu Nath and I walked up the stairs and then I got into on top of the stupa. You're not supposed to do that, but I did it. There were a lot of monkeys there. It's also called the monkey temple because there's lots of monkeys that live on that hill. And I was already taking pictures, but I knew nothing about photography, nothing at all. I knew nothing about pilgrimage. I knew nothing about Hinduism or Buddhism. I'm 12 years old. But I'm on top of this Swayambhu Nath stupa, which is different than Bodhnath stupa in Kathmandu. And Swayambhu Nath is more important. And when I was there, I conceived of this idea, but to me, it was divinity speaking to me, divinity manifesting itself in me. I conceived of this notion that one day I would like to come back and make a photography book. I didn't know what pilgrimage places were at this point. I didn't know that differentiation, but a photography book of beautiful, holy places, temples in India and Nepal. And really it began at that point, but I didn't know it began at that point. I didn't know that. And so I'm in India for 4 years. And the first journey I took on my own, when my mother felt I was sufficiently trained as a traveler, I went from Old Delhi on the train station in Old Delhi to Amritsar, the major Sikh temple. And when I was in Amritsar, I also began to fall in love with the practice of individual traveling on my own. And I feel there is a certain sort of limitation that is imposed upon people if they travel with a group. And I speak about this because just 2 months ago, I was in Libya, in Algeria. What was I doing there? There were some Islamic pilgrimage shrines that I wanted to go to, but it's very, very, very difficult to be able to get into Libya or Algeria as an individual traveler. Right. So I went with a group. But the problem with the group is the group didn't have spiritual interest. They were just seeing places of monumental architecture and old Roman fortresses and stuff like that, which I also was interested in, but I was really interested in these pilgrimage shrines, especially 2 of them in Algeria. But there was an imposition of time imposed upon me by the tour group. And that's not good. Sometimes, it's a conundrum. Sometimes you can't get into the place unless you go to a tour group, but then you're limited in how long you can be there. So when I was in this one pilgrimage shrine in Western Algeria that I'd been trying to go to for 35 years called Tlemcen. It's the burial site of a certain Sunni Sufi sage in Islam. And the group went there in the afternoon. They're very quick. They weren't interested in it. They took a couple of pictures, none of which were any good. But I was able to go in the morning. And the administrator of the site he sensed something about me. He really liked me. And I got to sit in right by the cenotaph, right by where the sage had been buried. And I stayed there 2 hours. And people were coming in, they were on the other side of this sort of fence. And some of them could see me in there. Oh, there's this American. They didn't know I was American. There's this white person in there. There's a Caucasian in there. And what was I doing in there? I was praising divinity. I was praying to divinity. I was connecting with divinity. And so when I was at Amritsar, when I was 13 years old and I was free, there was not a group imposing anything on me. I could be moved by, guided by divinity. And so I was on a yogic path without knowing I was on a yogic path. God, goddess, had, again, Great Spirit has no divinity. I mean, has no gender. God had taken me and begun this teaching that now, okay, so I'm about to turn 70. And so we're talking more than 50 years ago that I've been on this path, on this yogic path, but where I've been in this divine embrace, And I can't remember the name of the pilgrimage shrine that I was at in southern India a couple of years ago. And there's a place of Shiva is actually hugging Hanuman, hugging. And that's what I feel is happening to me. But the words that I'm using right now, you're not going to hear social anthropologists. You're not going to hear scholars in Vedism talk about this. They're just going to pull up the book and they're going to show you this passage and they're going to read it in Sanskrit to you. And they're going to say something. And then here's this American guy who is not a Hindu. And this American guy is saying these outrageous things. But this American guy has a very, very, very deep connection with what those scriptures are about. And a lot of times the people that wrote those scriptures and chant those scriptures nowadays, they don't have that. They don't have that connection.
How does one, for instance, Martin, one yoga person said, like, this energy has to be, it's like a tank which has to be filled up at regular intervals. So, you go experience something at Amritsar, then do you experience the same thing? And what does it do to you personally? Does it, uplift you, continue? Does it keep you at a certain level all the time? Or when you feel it slightly depleting, you go back to another? What is the emotional changes that happen within you?
Well, first of all, I'd say it doesn't have to be filled up all the time or at any time because it's already completely full. They have this notion in America, sometimes you will hear people talking about self-development. And I go, no, that's not a good idea. The self is already totally developed. What you need is self-discovery. I had a friend named Punjaji, he's now passed away, who was a senior disciple of Ramana Maharshi. And the title of one of his books, the title is really almost in a sense, you don't need to read the book. Just remember the title. And the title of the book was Call Off the Search. Call off the search. Right. And throughout the book, Punjaji would say this, and we often used to talk about it and we joke about it. And he would say the search is getting in the way of people actually finding that which is already there. And so people go through these different religious practices, these different yoga practices. They go through all of these practices, and maybe it's a rare thing, sad to say, it's a rare thing. But for some people, finally, they achieve that reuniting, not that development, but that reuniting, that discovery of that essential oneness, that essential divinity within themselves. And then they look back and they go, oh, all those things that I was doing to find that, then I find that it was already there. And all those things that I were doing were sort of getting in the way. So in the sense of refilling up, is it necessary? I don't think it's necessary, but I think it's very, very helpful to go to pilgrimage site, because then you see other people expressing devotion. You see other people in whatever stage of practicing prayer and praise, and it reminds you that there's something greater than the mind. It reminds you that there's something within, that divinity resides within you. And then whatever yogic practice or whatever religious tradition you're involved in, then you continue to do that. And chances are, probability is that most people will pass their entire life just doing that. They'll practice their entire life habituated to a certain practice. And the culture supports them in that, and the culture actually programs them into that. And the religious traditions program them into that. And I think a really great example of that is Ramakrishna. So Ramakrishna came to that shrine in Dakshineshwar in Calcutta, and he was, he already had some evident religious devotion, and he was made a priest of the temple, but it really didn't work out for the reason that he couldn't stay in a box. He had such extraordinary devotion for divinity. And I don't know if you've ever read about Ramakrishna, but he had this practice of direct experience of divinity, and the divinity, these deities, would manifest to him. And he was way outside of the practice of Hinduism, way outside. He was way outside of that. He wasn't practicing any ritual. He was just completely overcome with adoration of the divine. And then the divinities manifested to him. And that's a very rare experience, a very, very rare experience. Most people get locked into the practice of a particular religion, depending upon the country that they're brought up in or they're born in, and then they get caught in the practice of that particular religion, the way the priests or the imam or the Brahmins say that it should be done. And in a sense, that's good. In a sense, that's good. But in another sense, it's not, I'm hesitant to use the word good here. It's not good because what it does, in a sense, it keeps people away from that very thing they're seeking, because they get caught in the practice of religious tradition. And I think what you need to do is, the religious traditions become a pointer, but don't get caught in the pointer. Go where the pointer tells you to go. And that's what I've done, by the grace of God. The other day I was talking to somebody and they were saying, oh, and you've done this. And I went, no, that's not the right way to look at it. What has divinity done through me? Not what have I done, but how has divinity awoken inside of me? And that is, now I'm very clear on that. I'm very, very clear on that. But that took 20 some years of an assiduous, a very disciplined practice also of meditation. I began doing meditation, a Vipassana type of meditation, when I was 18 years old. At the same time, and that's Jnana Yoga, at the same time that I was doing Bhakti Yoga, but two things. I didn't realize the profundity of the type of meditation I was practicing. I didn't understand that. And then I didn't really understand how important Bhakti Yoga is, not only in this yuga, but in a human's life. I didn't understand that. And then those things came together. I grew up, I became more mature as a man. I went to more and more sacred sites. I read a whole lot of hagiography. Now, hagiography is a very interesting thing. Hagiography is the biographies of saints and sages. You could have a biography of Napoleon or Bismarck. They're not very inspiring people. But when you get a biography of Shankara, when you get a biography of a saint or a sage, it's very important to look at what this person was doing to try to have union with God. And so I read a whole lot of these biographies, hagiography of these saints and sages. And again, I saw commonalities. What are they doing? And that's what I'm also doing. And so even though, and if I took this iPad and the camera into my library, you'd go, oh, there's so many books. And 70, 80, 90% of the books I've read. And what are the books saying? What are the books are saying is they're pointing at something. But again, most people get caught in the pointer and they don't go deeper. And by the grace of divinity, by the grace of God, I've gone deeper.
You're also a karma yogi, and I think your tool for karma is your camera. Is it? Is it? And for there is a analogy in the way the temples are constructed, Martin. They say that from the entrance you go deeper and deeper into darkness. The spaces get darker and more confined, and it's like going inside oneself. And in the Garbhagriha, it's pitch dark with just the lamps burning, so that you actually are not distracted by anything else. So when you're taking your pictures, and with all the meditation you've done, how does the light, sense of light, and the sense of tuning out the world and tuning in to what's important, how does that manifest in your work?
Very good question. And for me, the answer is, there's a number of answers there. For me, when you say karma yoga, I see what I do with my photography as karma yoga. And they also, so one thing very important about karma yoga is don't be attached to the results of your actions. Very, very important. So I do what I do. And for a long time, I was attached to the results of the action. I wanted people to get it. And some people get it then, and some people never get it. And I have certain responses to that. But now my photography, I'm even hesitant to call it photography, because most people, when they think about a photograph, you get a camera. I've been, for the last few years, I've just been using this. It's a wonderful camera, an iPhone. I used to have all these big cameras. I don't use them anymore. But for a long time, I thought of photographs produce pictures, and people look at, there's the key word, the operative word, they look at the pictures. And then I began thinking, no. And there was a woman named Diana Eck. She wrote a couple of great books on Hinduism and Hindu pilgrimage sites. And one of them was called Darshan. And I think I've spoken to Diana Eck a couple times by email, but I've never spoken to her by phone or in person. She's a very good writer, and she's had a very large experience of Hindu pilgrimage. She's been to a lot of these sites. And then she wrote this book called Darshan. And in the notion of what Darshan means is, a lot of times people think, oh, it's the view of the deity, because there's been a statue, it's been concentrated. So Shiva's in the statue or Saraswati's in the statue. And people are having a view of the divinity. It goes both ways. The divinity is having a view of the devotee. So the darshan becomes a transfer of view, of energy, of divinity, of adoration. It becomes a transfer of that. So I began thinking, my photographs can be looked at as photographs. And I've had them in a lot of galleries, and you can have the photograph on the gallery wall, and people walk in and they're looking at it. But at the same time, when I compose these photographs, when I'm pointing the camera, there's a prayer in my heart to the spirit, the local spirit of place. And this is a very interesting thing, and we could get into this. The local spirit of the place, I'm asking for assistance. And I say, please help me in the composition of this image, such that if someone, for example, there's a city which I've never been to in America called Cincinnati. And let's say somebody is in Cincinnati and they go into a gallery and they see one of my photographs. Now that person's never been in India or never been in Bolivia or never been in Russia. And they're just looking at a picture hanging on the wall in Cincinnati. But my feeling, and this is, even if they don't know this is happening, it's still happening. Even if they don't know it's happening, they are getting the darshan of the sacred site. They're getting the darshan of the deity, because the photograph is not a photograph, it's a window. It's a window. And so when you're looking through the window, you're seeing that divinity, and the divinity is looking back through the window to you. And so we could say there's a transference, a transferal of the visual homeopathic essence of that which it's a photograph of. Now, somebody might take a photograph of birds, or they might take a photograph of whatever they take a photograph, but I'm taking a photograph of places that are imbued with a very, very high concentration of divinity. And because when I composed those photographs, I was not thinking, oh, let me take a pretty picture. What I was thinking is, let me compose this in such a way that it's a window, So when other people are in front of that window, they're getting the darshan. That's very, very strong notion in my head. And in the last real 25, 30 years, I'm always thinking that. But even before I was conscious of that notion, because the other day I was looking at in one of my books, I was looking at some photographs that I took windows that I made in 1984, 1985, and they're extraordinarily well composed. And I didn't have the notion in my head at that point that these photographs could not just be something to look at, but could be windows to look through. And yet still, they were very well composed, and still I think they function in that way.
We also have certain rules in some temples, where the main vigraha is not, forbidden from being photographs. Just precisely for this reason that, the energy field is diminished in some way, or, there's something that has to be experienced firsthand and not through. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's another great question. And I would say that, because the darshan lines, you go into one of the major pilgrimage sites, and sometimes you're waiting in line. I mean, go to Tirupati, go to Tiruvannamalai, go to some of these, and you will be in line in the darshan line for 2 or 3 hours, and maybe you'll pay 20 or 100 rupees and you can get into the quicker line. But if all people are carrying a camera, it would slow things down. It would slow things down. So that's one of the reasons. I feel myself, and I feel this in whatever the shrine of whatever religion, that I have a higher allegiance to the divinity, to God, than I do to the shrine administrators. I definitely do. I used to be conflicted about this, because sometimes there are some pilgrimage cathedrals in Europe that long time ago, I wanted to be in the shrine and not have all of these hundreds of pilgrims coming. So I would hide in the shrine, in the church, and then it would be night and everybody go and I'm alone in there. And in the shrines in India, the pilgrimage temples in India, I will admit that sometimes I take a picture and there's even signs, no photographs allowed, no photographs allowed. And I see those, and yet still, if I can, I will take the photograph, because to me, I feel that God, Goddess, the Great Spirit has has given me a duty, has given me a service that I am supposed to do this. And, it's such an interesting thing, because you'll go to in India, some pilgrimage temples, and you're allowed to take pictures, and other ones you're not allowed to take pictures. So it's really sort of a decision or a dictate of the temple priests. It's not God saying you can do this or you can't do this. So I'm serving God rather than following the rules of men. I was at a pilgrimage shrine in southern India, not this last trip, but last year, and they caught me taking some pictures. And they told me to delete them. And the man stood there, and I deleted them, and he thought they were deleted. But when you delete them, they go to some other place, and then you'd have to delete those. And he didn't make me do that. So I went back there and I recovered them. And those pictures are on my website. And I didn't feel bad about that at all. I tricked him, but it was, to me, it comes from this deep desire to serve divinity. And so I don't worry if a religious authority tells me I can or I can't do something. They're a servant also of God. Sometimes they know it, and sometimes it's just a priestly family. It's a Brahmin family. It's 300, 400, 500 years that they've been the chief family in charge of that place, and they've got a couple of sons or daughters who are living in Luxembourg and doing whatever they're doing. And the oldest brother is the temple priest. And just because you're a temple priest doesn't mean you're a Ramakrishna. Doesn't mean you have that devotion. It's just a family thing. It's tradition. Your family watches over that temple. And I have to admit, I don't pay much attention to that.
Right. And one of the questions that we thought we would ask is, what do you see in the next 10, 20, maybe 50 years down the line? But I would like you to go back, maybe even before you were born. Like, we talk about three kinds of debts, Martin. We talk about the debt to the rishis, debt like Rina, the debt that we owe to our ancestors, to our rishis, and to our gods. Apparently, we all come with these three debts which we owe to them for all that we have in this life. So you talk about ancestors in different cultures and how they went around traveling and finding these spaces for us and actually putting markers for us. So what are your feelings to all the people who have come before you and have helped to make this a little easier for you?
Okay, I can answer that from a number of different vantage points. And in one sense, and this is because I have a very, very, very deep experience. About 8 to 10 years ago, you could say I achieved nirvikalpa samadhi. I achieved that oneness where there is no differences in apparent reality to me. So ancestors were beings that were a manifestation of deity that were alive 200, 500, 1,000 years ago. And then there's rishis that were alive 200, 500, 1,000 years ago, but they themselves are manifestations of divinity. And I see no differences. I see no distinctions any longer in that. So in one sense, I would say you have no debt, D-E-B-T. You have no debt to any ancestors. You have no debt to any rishis, but you don't even really have a debt to God. And all of these ancestors and all of these rishis, they were manifestations of divinity at that time, but you do not even have a debt to divinity. What you do is you have the opportunity to express devotion, adoration, love of that, not a debt, not a necessity to, but just this opportunity to say, I love you, God. If you choose to, or if you've been programmed by your particular religion, programmed by your particular religion that you think, you assume, a lot of times because of religious scripture which has been interpreted, in my opinion, incorrectly. If you assume that you have to express a certain debt, okay, you assume that. I don't think that's accurate. But if you do assume that, then you can practice karma yoga in whatever way that you're doing it. And I would I know that divinity is looking down or looking out from, it's everywhere, but divinity would be looking at human beings doing something that they think is good, but doing it for the wrong reason, doing it with a shallow understanding. I used to have that shallow understanding. Now my understanding is much, much deeper. And so I do not express, I feel no debt. I feel no debt at all. No, I only feel this joy and this opportunity to express devotion to the divinity of the world, but the divinity of the world is a manifestation of the divinity that is within all of us. So what I'm doing is I am in a constant state of saying, I love you. I love you. I love you. And the way in which I say I love you is through this service that I have done. And other people see this and other people perceive it, touch it, and hopefully that divinity passes through and touches, awakens something inside of them. Yeah.
One last question, Martin, is you make an appeal to share your book. You want to take your book far to politicians, journalists, to influencers and religious heads, so that there's, this idea of oneness and harmony is, spread through your work. So what is that project that you have undertaken and how do you hope to achieve that? Your first edition of your book printed more than, 50,000 copies, I think. So you want to take this, how do you want to take it further?
I'll answer that in a minute. Before that, part of the previous question of what do I see in 10 or 15 or 20 years? Two things I see. One, in, I've been in 168, 165 countries, so I've seen a lot. And what have I seen? I've seen a great deal of environmental degradation. I've seen a great deal of human beings not respecting this planet. I've seen a great deal. I've been in Sudan. I've been in Afghanistan. I've been in Syria. I've been in a lot of these places where there's problems that are occurring. And a lot of times it's because there's politicians that are greedy for power. And then a lot of times it's corporations that are greedy for money. And people do not have a deep connection with this earth. They don't have a deep connection with spirit. And so they take. And there is an exercise of greed and political power. And if you extrapolate that, if you look at the manifestation of that, as there's more and more people and there's more and more greed, there's more and more degradation. And the planet is suffering in a great deal. And I feel that this is going to continue. I think things, in one sense, are going to get quite a bit worse here on the planet. There will be more. I mean, I've been in Sudan, I've been in South Sudan. I know what's happening in Khartoum right now. And I know what's happening in a lot of these places where there's migrant movement. I really know this thing. I know where the forests are getting cut down. I know the coral bleaching. I know all of these things, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. At the same time, that because there's crisis, there is an awakening of consciousness. There's a transformation that is occurring because more and more people are becoming aware of their connection with this living being. We live on this living being. And you could say, oh, well, there's all these individual people on this, but it's one living being. And as more and more people awaken to an understanding of this, then there is a growth in people taking care of it. So you're going to see this concurrent thing occurring, that more and more degradation, more and more debt. There's some debt for you, more and more problems, but there's more and more people awakening and saying, how can I help? How can I serve? So that I have both good news and bad news about that. Yeah. So then how do I hope my work touches people? I wouldn't use the word work, my service, but for, this discussion, we can call it work. Well, that website of mine, which used to be called Places of Peace and Power, is now called World Pilgrimage Guide. It's had 230 million visitors since 1996. It's one of the 30,000 most visited websites in the world. Everything on it is completely for free. And I give all of my pictures for free. National Geographic used to get this upset with me because they sell my pictures and they get money for it and I get some, but I give my pictures away for free. Anybody that wants to use them, you can use them for free, and you don't even have to credit Martin Gray. Just credit the website so people will know where they can see more of them. And again, it's my way. Other people have different ways of serving. This is my way of serving divinity here on this suffering planet. So now I have this new book that just came out called Secret Sacred Sites. I've had 6 books. This new one just came out. And it is again, and when the publisher got in touch with me to do this book, I said, okay, you don't have to pay me anything. He said, what? I said, you don't have to pay me anything. The money that you would pay me, put that into promotion of the book so more people will know about it. He said, nobody ever does that. I've never heard of that. That's extraordinary. I went, oh, well, whether it's extraordinary or not, put the money that you would pay me into promotion of the book so more people will know about it. Same thing with all my photographs. I give them away. I give them away. I give them away. So my feeling, what I'm trying to do, this is great. When I was a little boy, I used to say, to Great Spirit, let me be a glove on the hand of God. Let me be a paintbrush in the hands of perfection. And I was saying that when I was 6 or 7 years old, and I had no idea what that meant. None. And now at 70 years old, I am indeed have become, by the grace of God, I have become a paintbrush in the hands of perfection. And it is using that paintbrush in the way it is using through my life. Other people are used in different ways. But for me, that's happening. And I say, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm always saying thank you. And then more is given, more is given. And so I don't know how much longer I'll be here on this planet. I feel like my work is done. I finished photographing the sacred sites, and I have been abiding in a very, very deep state of connection with divinity, with oneness. And so I feel like I'm done here. I feel like I'm done here. I feel like I'm done here. And we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. We'll see whatever the divinity wishes for me. And so you see, this is very different than most social anthropologists talking about pilgrimage, because I'm talking about being a pilgrim, and I'm talking about the manifestation of divinity in this particular pilgrim. Yeah, that's what I'm doing. And it's interesting because I got an invitation yesterday to speak at a conference that's happening in England in June, and then to speak at one that's happening in Kyoto, Japan in July. And what are they? They're just conferences of social anthropologists. And I'm thinking, okay, if I go to this, these men, mostly men, they're going to go, oh, this guy's either beautiful or crazy, because he's not talking about measurements and things. He doesn't do that. He's a pilgrim. So what I encourage people to do, and I hope there's some people that are watching this, give your life to praise and prayer. Seek a connection with divinity. You don't have to develop it. It's already there. Just seek it, seek it, seek it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Martin. It was really
बहुत
lovely.
धन्यवाद, बहुत धन्यवाद.
Oh, धन्यवाद. ये जो picture है बहुत distracting. जो you have the yantra behind you on your.
Yeah. That's a very, very important yantra. Very important. I could talk about that in some detail. That's a very, very important one.
Yes. So where did you get it from?
This one is somewhere in southern India. You know, I bought it. It's a cloth one. I bought it somewhere in southern India. Yeah, it's been hanging in my place. I look at it lots of times. I stand in front of it and look at it a lot of times. I could go in a lot more detail about what that means. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Martin,
Yeah.
and wishing you all the best. And I hope some of your divinity comes to us, to me particularly.
And I hope next time I'm in India, I don't know when that will be, but I would like to meet you.
Oh, I would love to meet you too, Martin. Yeah.
Okay.
It would be such a privilege and pleasure. Thank you
Thank you.
so much, and namaste.